Geopolitics has long been regarded as a game of possibilities, but recent developments in February 2026 have demonstrated with remarkable clarity that it is equally an art of improbabilities. For some time now, and with particular intensity over the past year, a powerful narrative had been gaining momentum across international discourse, that the American dollar was approaching the end of its dominance, that the BRICS group of nations would launch a unified alternative currency, that de-dollarization was imminent, and that the era of dollar hegemony was drawing to a close. This narrative was constructed with considerable force and conviction, amplified across geopolitical forums, academic circles, and media commentary worldwide. Yet the story has now changed in ways that few analysts anticipated, and the epicenter of this change is not Washington, it is Moscow. Reports emerging from the Kremlin indicate that a 7-point memorandum has been circulated internally, one that appears deceptively simple in its language but carries explosive implications in its substance. Russia is preparing to re-enter the American dollar settlement system and has signaled its readiness to do so. This is the same Russia that was ejected from the SWIFT international financial messaging system by Western nations following the invasion of Ukraine, the same Russia that found itself unable to conduct standard international settlements, and the same Russia that had repeatedly and publicly characterized the dollar as the most dangerous weapon in the geopolitical arsenal of its adversaries, a poison instrument of economic warfare. The central question that this development raises is profound. Is Russia making a strategic retreat? Or is this the outcome of a calculated diplomatic masterstroke by the Trump administration? And beneath that question lies an even more sobering truth. Have we collectively arrived at the conclusion that while one may harbor deep resentment toward the dollar, the power to replace it simply does not yet exist? To understand this shift fully, it is essential to examine the foundations of the BRICS bloc and the ambitions that were associated with it. BRICS is no longer the 5-nation grouping it was at its inception. It has evolved into a loose coalition of 10 countries, collectively accounting for approximately 35% of global gross domestic product. By the early weeks of 2026, BRICS member nations had reportedly conducted around 67% of their mutual trade in local currencies rather than in dollars. On the surface, this figure appears remarkably impressive, even transformative. However, embedded within this statistic is a critical misconception that must be carefully unpacked. Conducting bilateral or multilateral trade in local currencies is an entirely different matter from creating a single unified BRICS currency. These are not 2 points on the same continuum. They are fundamentally distinct propositions, requiring entirely different political, economic, and institutional architectures. Russia's deputy foreign minister made this distinction painfully explicit in a recent statement when he declared that a single BRICS currency is simply not on the agenda. This is not a casual remark or a temporary diplomatic position. It represents a strategic acknowledgement of structural reality. Russia itself is conceding that the concept of a common BRICS currency was never seriously within the realm of practical implementation. India, for its part, never publicly championed a shared currency either. The reasons for this are rooted in elementary economics. A shared currency among sovereign nations requires, at minimum, a harmonized monetary policy across all member states, broad consensus on inflation targets, synchronization of interest rate regimes, and, perhaps most critically, a foundation of deep institutional trust between participating countries. When one considers that India and China, the 2 most powerful pillars of BRICS and the drivers of much of its economic weight, are nations that have engaged in active military standoffs along their disputed Himalayan border, and whose mutual mistrust has reached historic highs in recent years, the notion of either country placing its financial sovereignty and monetary credibility within a shared system governed partly by the other becomes untenable. The BRICS currency dream, therefore, was not defeated by external pressure or Western sanctions. It failed its own internal mathematics. It succeeded as a diplomatic narrative. It succeeded as a vehicle for signaling multipolarity and dissatisfaction with the existing global financial order. And it succeeded in generating a geopolitical conversation about alternatives to dollar dominance. But in the domain of practical economics and financial architecture, it could not pass the most basic stress tests. This brings the analysis squarely back to Russia and the question of why it has chosen, or felt compelled, to contemplate a return to dollar-denominated settlement frameworks. The answer lies in a phenomenon that economists refer to as a liquidity trap, And Russia's experience of this trap over the past several years has been both instructive and humbling. Since being expelled from the SWIFT system, Russia has conducted the majority of its international trade in Chinese yuan and Indian rupees. The logic of this arrangement appeared sound at the time. If the dollar was the weapon being used against Russia, then bypassing it through alternative currencies would reduce vulnerability and demonstrate the viability of non-dollar trade. In practice, however, the consequences were far more constraining than anticipated. Russia sold enormous volumes of petroleum products and other commodities, transactions worth billions of dollars in real economic value, and received yuan and rupees in return. The problem was not in receiving these currencies. It was in deploying them. The Chinese yuan is subject to strict capital controls imposed by Beijing, which means that entities holding large quantities of yuan cannot freely invest or spend those funds in global markets. The currency cannot flow with the same freedom and convertibility that the dollar offers. The Indian rupee presents an analogous challenge. It has limited global acceptability and cannot easily be used to purchase goods, services, or financial instruments outside of a narrow set of trading relationships. Russia thus found itself holding vast reserves of currencies that looked valuable on paper but were functionally trapped, unable to be reinvested, redistributed, or leveraged in the global marketplace. The realization that crystallized from this experience is one of profound importance for understanding the dollar's position in the international monetary system. The dollar is not merely a currency. It is the world's largest and most accessible liquidity window. It is the medium through which capital flows across borders, through which commodities are priced, through which financial instruments are denominated, and through which sovereign wealth can be deployed into global markets. A nation that steps outside the dollar framework does not merely change its preferred medium of exchange, it effectively removes itself from the primary circulatory system of global finance. For Russia, the experience of operating outside this system has translated into a liquidity crisis of its own making. And the 7-point memorandum emerging from the Kremlin is, in essence, a document acknowledging that reality. The contours of the understanding reportedly being negotiated between Moscow and Washington are built on 3 major pillars, each of which illuminates a different dimension of the transaction being conducted. The first concerns energy, specifically a fossil fuel-first strategy that cuts against the prevailing global discourse on climate transition and green energy. At a moment when most of the world's major economies are accelerating commitments to renewable energy and reducing dependence on hydrocarbons, Russia and the United States appear to be engineering a convergence around oil, gas, and liquefied natural gas, all priced and settled in dollars. This is not a coincidence of interests. It is a deliberate alignment of 2 nations that both stand to benefit enormously from sustained global demand for fossil fuels and from ensuring that this demand is channeled through dollar-denominated markets. The second pillar involves critical minerals, a domain in which Russia holds extraordinary leverage. China has in recent years tightened its grip on the global supply of rare earth elements and critical minerals, using its dominant market position as a geopolitical instrument. Russia, for its part, controls an estimated 40% of the world's palladium reserves, a mineral without which microchips cannot be manufactured, electric vehicles cannot be produced, and aerospace technologies are severely constrained. The United States, seeking to reduce its dependence on Chinese supply chains for these strategically vital materials, has a compelling interest in securing access to Russian reserves. Russia, in turn, has a compelling interest in accessing the purchasing power, financial infrastructure, and market depth that the American economy provides. The third pillar, and in many ways the soul of this entire arrangement, is the return to dollar settlement. This is not an ideological convergence between 2 nations with sharply divergent worldviews and political systems. It is rather what might be described as balance sheet diplomacy, a transactional recalibration of interests driven by economic necessity on one side and strategic calculation on the other. The United States has a clear interest in ensuring that dollar dominance is reinforced, that the narrative of de-dollarization is deflated, and that Russia is pulled further from the orbit of China. Russia has a clear interest in stabilizing the ruble, reducing the costs and frictions of international transactions, and restoring meaningful access to global capital markets. Neither side is conceding its deeper ambitions. Each is simply recognizing where its short-term interests align with the others. The financial markets registered this shift with remarkable speed and clarity. On the 13th of February 2026, when reports of this understanding first emerged, markets responded within 30 minutes. Silver prices fell by approximately 10%, and gold prices in India dropped by around 6,000 rupees per 10 grams. These movements are not arbitrary. They reflect a specific and well-understood logic. Gold functions as an anti-dollar bet in global markets. When confidence in the dollar weakens, when doubts about its longevity as the world's reserve currency intensify, investors and institutions move capital into gold as a store of value that exists outside the dollar-denominated system. Conversely, when the dollar's dominance appears to be reaffirmed, when a major challenger retreats and the narrative of dollar decline loses credibility, the incentive to hold gold as a hedge diminishes, and capital flows back toward dollar-denominated assets such as United States Treasury securities. The market's reaction to the Moscow-Washington understanding was a textbook illustration of this dynamic. Institutions read the signals, recalculated the probability of near-term dollar decline, and reallocated accordingly. Markets, it must be emphasized, do not operate on sentiment or ideology. They operate on signals, probabilities, and the anticipated trajectory of economic power. The signal emanating from Moscow in February 2026 was unambiguous. The most vocal and determined advocate of de-dollarization had concluded that the alternative pathways were not yet functional and was reorienting toward the very system it had spent years denouncing. India's position in this evolving landscape is worth examining with particular care, because it illustrates a fundamentally different approach to the question of dollar dependence. India never declared the death of the dollar, never pursued de-dollarization as an explicit policy goal, and never aligned itself with the maximalist rhetoric of dollar replacement. Instead, India chose the path of strategic autonomy, a flexible, interest-driven foreign policy that prioritized diversification over confrontation. India's stated position has consistently been straightforward. It will purchase energy and commodities wherever they are most cost-effective, and it will engage with whatever trading frameworks best serve its national interests. If Russia were to return to dollar-based settlement, one immediate consequence for India would be the unlocking of billions of rupees currently held in Vostro accounts, funds accumulated through rupee-denominated trade with Russia that have been difficult to deploy meaningfully. Trade would become simpler and transaction costs would fall. But perhaps the more durable lesson India can draw from this episode is conceptual. That narratives, however compelling, are not substitutes for systems. The world is not changed by declarations of intent, or by the rhetorical force of alternative visions. It is changed by the patient construction of alternative institutions, infrastructure, and mechanisms that can actually bear the weight of global commerce. India's path has never been de-dollarization in the sense of a direct challenge to dollar supremacy. It has been diversification, expanding its presence in multiple markets, building bilateral trade frameworks, and incrementally reducing its exposure to the vulnerabilities that come with excessive dependence on any single system. That approach, modest and undramatic as it may appear, has proven considerably more robust than the ambitious but structurally under-engineered vision of a BRICS alternative. The ultimate question, then, is whether de-dollarization as a concept and as a long-term trajectory is now finished, whether Russia's pivot back toward the dollar signals the permanent defeat of the idea. The answer, considered carefully, is no. What has collapsed is not the underlying structural logic that drives countries to seek alternatives to dollar dependence. What has collapsed is the specific and premature claim that those alternatives were already available and ready to be deployed at scale. The dollar is not unchallenged, and it is not without vulnerabilities. Its dominance rests on institutional inertia, on the absence of credible alternatives, and on the enormous network effects that come from being the world's most widely accepted medium of exchange. These are powerful foundations, but they are not eternal guarantees. The process of de-dollarization, understood not as a revolutionary rupture but as a slow, structural shift in the global monetary order, will likely continue over decades. Driven by the gradual internationalization of other currencies, the development of alternative payment infrastructure, and the accumulation of trust in non-dollar financial systems. But Russia's decision to return to the dollar settlement framework makes unmistakably clear that this transformation is not imminent, not complete, and not inevitable on any near-term horizon. The dollar may be wounded by years of weaponization and the resentment that weaponization generates, but it has no credible rival prepared to assume its role. You may despise the rules of a game, but if no alternative game yet exists, you must eventually return to the field where play is still possible. That is the lesson Moscow has now delivered, not through rhetoric, but through the unambiguous language of economic necessity.